So there was a crime. Yes, a body was found. GP. The initials were written on it, carved in. Yes, into the inside of the thigh. Yes. What condition was it in? Well, detective, it had choked to death in the private booth. On what? Well, that's what was said in the court case, the inquiry. On what? Well, what was said? Well, she said she cut his throat open so he could breathe. I see. Yes, and then here's the body of the picture. Just see this long wizened hair and sweat and grease and wreathed. Yeah. Oh, I see. Right. And what then? Well, photographs were given as evidence, and it's a picture of Vera, the actress, and Shirley. Yeah, you see here. Yeah, from Carousel in the early 1950s. I see. Beautiful. Costumes were found in a wardrobe. Oh, I see. Yes, and that was a crime. And in a camera, yes, it was found in the furniture of the wardrobe. Pictures were taken. Yeah, David Pringle and Mary Cameron. The line of this family. Michael Cameron, he was earlier Prime Minister of the island, this area. Yeah, this, 2,100 years ago or something. It's like Europe, all these places, they have, memory remains in the mind, but they've disappeared. You must realise that this is a diary that was found, and you slot it in. It's just a disc they had then, a minor piece of apparatus, and up comes, you see, on the screen, the words, and you run the film through the lens. Yeah, that protrudes from it and pictures up on the mirror screen there, the surface, the graphite. You watch it, see? It's that, yeah, well, the fellow with long hair, that was Jesus. Yeah, he was a major player in that era, and a major star, actually. He was the one who actually had the word that made sense. Love thyself, love all, love thy neighbours. Well, yes, well, Mary Magdalene was his muse, and Mary was his mother, and Joseph. There was another Jonah. He was a predecessor, yes. There were disciples, but there were many. There were ones who tried. Louis the 16th, Antoinette. She was smeared the name Marie later. Yes, never said let them eat cake. It was a frame. It's Joan of Arc was another, massacred and mutilated by the English. We've stopped sending others down there now. There's no point. It's just, well, it was just a ruin, but then there's no one there anymore. So there we are. We've all shifted and moved to Mars, and we live up here now, and well, everybody's become a bit more gentle and worked out their karma, and it's all a lot easier now. 200,000 years is all it took. That's these tombstones, they're just remnants and relics, aren't they? Fossils, marks. I know, well, if you really want to know what happened, you might as well listen to the rest of it. It's on this tape here, this CD, this old contraption that they've used. Here, I'll flick the switch and you can listen. He used to be a Queen's Counsel, a doctor, a doctor, a doctor, a surgeon. DP, DP initials, DDP, David Casebook by Dr. Richard Hood, MD, BA, LLB, in an examination of the self of a woman. The Ring of Evil and Live is a play she recorded, and it was her pioneering work as a patient that enabled I to invent and discover the pirate machine, invented to help me help victims, paralysed victims, as she, in spirit, internally. There was music, curtain, it was written down. A roll of film was found, played. This is the story of a psychologist, a lawyer, a doctor, and how it came to be. That is, the scenes and screenings you have heard and seen. Okay. Right, well, that's the first page of the doctor's diary. Read on the rest for posterity. We're putting this in the archives. Okay, his notes go on. You were sucked down, the audience, we all were, filming in the camera. The camera, third eye, filmed all of us watching, and we were showing the film of the intimates in a mental asylum. They were prisoners. Turn the page there, won't you? Yeah, John? Okay, thanks. Right, I see the picture in the window, he says. He refers here to the mutilation, throat surgery. I see, chamber. Oh, here it is. He goes on here. Right, chapter 11 he's called it, even though it's in the beginning. All right, I'll read it out. In the area in which I had entered, the attic, I had discovered a map that gave me an indication of the rooms, composition and floors of Acadia. It consisted of a quilt work of patterns and looked like a bee's hive with a missing queen. On each floor I watched as the swirling pattern seemed to evoke a mystery from the skies in the window, on all fours before which I sat, and the room's cells, the tombs, came into view, as if they were tuned into a channel of equilibrium and gravity that stood before me. Thus far I seemed to have survived, and it seemed to be that another compartment could be reached through the time machine television's two-way mirror that could take me to the areas in which I fixed when watching by choice, by using the rocket fuel to locate the plane that had come down, and on which I could travel by smell, and using whatever capacity I could harness to rotate the inner flywheel that I was convinced was broken, and use it to propel me out of time and experience, to consider the position West Sussex and the Queen and the United Kingdom were in. Right, that's the first chapter. Now, number 2, he's got a subcategory here. Right, he goes on. You may ask how it was possible to intuit these conclusions. I was able to see the different compartments of Acadia on the time machine television, it is true, but some parts were in darkness. The screen did not reveal, and although I lived in Acadia before, some compartments had not been brought into view. The centre eluded me. The position in which I lived and worked had been the area of the vestibule. Ah, yes, of the church. And now this area was converted to cells. I had known it as an area that had been a lounge, a home, on one floor, in the form of a compartment in which I had been born. I had travelled up to town, to London, and around other areas in the Union of the United Kingdom, where I had worked as an archaeologist and an astrophysicist. When I had worked in politics, I had lived in London. Acadia had been our palace, as it were, out of town, and my father and mother were occupied. They had occupied it when they were down in West Sussex. But now I had seen those to which I referred as Martians occupied it, the police, the sergeants, and the detectives. But these had been traitors. They were originally members of the United Kingdom Constabulary, but had converted their allegiance to their alien masters, and it was these I labelled as Martians. Also, as a consequence of their choice, being utilised to serve the new regime and imprison my brother, or otherwise known as my father, my elder brother. Right. They were obviously not aware of the identity of their captive, prisoner number 9. They still sought the higher serving officer, but I could see them in my screen, and Robert, the English version, and I was hastened by their activity of energy to locate the discovery of the plane that had been burnt in another area of time, another era of time, on the radar area that I had observed when the time machine television had fixed on the park. That area of observation told me that my father's identity, and that he would escape and be recaptured and brought back to the capital of Arcadia by the detectives and confronted by the sergeant in the year 2000. For as I looked down on the time machine side, I saw the dial that measured time. It had been fixed for the period throughout which I had watched the initial arrest, the stop, but now I saw that it moved forward from 1997 to 2000, and there on the screen again, as if of its own accord, presented, it was a flying ship that was a jet again, and the wingtips peeled off and the frames fell away as the cinders floated off in flakes, and my father lay on the ground in the park, and the plane seemed to invisibly vanish, dissolve away. Was my mother? Where was she? For some reason the thought came to me, was she burnt alive? Had she died? I could not believe my father would leave her. But as I say, I heard the next morning a terrific furore, and I shall tell you about it as I get ready to do the diary, dust off the area on this page for another day. The next morning I heard a terrible furore. The sergeant entered. A storm seemed to blow outside the Arcadia, across the terrain of the universe, for I could see its movement through the planets and the Milky Way on the screen of the time machine television. The storm hurled streams of black streaks of the vapours of carbon and chemicals I had seen at the time of the Martians' invasion over the clouds of West Sussex in England. Contemporaneously with these blows that hurled themselves at the earth, I saw the sergeant approach my father and heard him say, "You must go through the process. All is being changed." I hurled myself up the ladder to the window at the attic from the compartment of the conning tower. There I saw the black skies over the channel. Planes dived, and black and yellow fissures of measures of streams of missiles appeared to hurl themselves at the shores and plains of West Sussex, and their effect had the immediacy of making the landscape curl and die as the vegetation succumbed to the poisonous rays of the missiles. The housing of the area had crumbled, and jets dove and dived. The screaming intensity of the assault was horrendous, and it seemed as if nothing could survive. I looked at the petrol, rocket supply, and reassured myself. If I could somehow locate the jet plane of my father and mother's, that I was sure had disappeared in time under the effect of some kind of dissolving effect and solution that was mixed in the radar and death rays of the Martians, I was sure I could reactivate it and gain my father's escape and mine, and perhaps detect the whereabouts of mother at the same time. But Robert was faced with a dreadful experiment, for as I came down the era of define and provide, down the ladder, I saw the time 1997, and the words, "This one should complete our task. He's got the measurements." What did that mean? In the beginning and the end, time had converged. As I gazed out to sea, I could see the time machine transmitter in balance over the channel from Arcadia. The area that had been invaded had parted and taken me through the opening of the foreign alien area of the invaders as I moved forward, making and feeling my way through unfamiliar terrain as the sun poured its rays upon the advent of a new day that took me to the culmination of my quest for the Holy Grail. devastation and destruction of the wasteland had been evident all around me. War had taken its toll. H.G. Wells had been a pioneer, and a fragment of the route he had travelled in the time machine, and it had taken me to the end of my quest in the form of presentation of the contents of a poem that had been washed up in a bottle off the coast of West Sussex at the Channel, which, when translated, revealed the recordings of a battle of minds that had occurred at the end of time with the Martians when they had invaded. But kindness and understanding had ultimately prevailed in a revaluation of justice in the final exchange with the judge in the year 2000, when my father had confronted the court in the last battle of the war that finally put the matter of Britain to rest when the Martians had invaded our soil in the year of our Lord, 1997. I had found the bottle in a stream just outside Arcadia, next to the Channel, before I had been taken inside subsequently. Robert, my father, had been freed eventually. But how had his release been achieved? How was it that these events had been seen and presented to me before they formed history? It was true that Arcadia's capsule, which I had entered and into which I had been taken, contained an internal camera, held and supported by beams. It had been fronted by the Madonna. You remember? In the first scenes, in the beginning? Well, when I had entered into this area and into which I had been taken, I found it contained an internal camera, held and supported by beams. I have said that, and my voice was fractured and cracked and would not work. It was broken, and it was a result of the schizophrenic welding and moulding of the alien way of talking and thinking, the generalized, abstract, imposed, dictatorial, totalitarian regimes, narrow strip of forcing us into being the same, and the crack between that imposition and my resistance to it and my original spirit had caused the inner conflict and the fissure down the middle of the Union and the Civil War, which had been caused by this imposition of this one order of the world. Well, I entered, and the internal camera, as I have said, was held and supported by beams, and measured and stored the information it saw of the catastrophe by recording by means of an inner apparatus that viewed thoughts of participants in defeats and victories, which it photographed in memory and translated it into a dialect automatically, which I could read and understand when the Martians communicated between themselves and other beings. And it has been this process that enabled me to observe their imagination's journeys as I tracked and I watched their interactions on the screen of the time machine television, to which was sent messages through a cylindrical tube that was connected to the camera, which snapped the events as they occurred and sent them to a valve which scrambled and translated them into a serial film, which you have heard, and ordered the participants' thoughts. The method had been perfected by Arcadia, but she had been captured, and the secrets of this machinery had been reduced to an invention by the Martians of miniature form that was used to convert and transport the flow of natural events from the memory to the universe, from the memory up via the solar plexus in individuals to the universe, and return them as patterns to the recording camera, which distorted them and as it snapped them and called them, quote, the measurements, unquote. Then the Martians would distill their yield and examine the contents that resulted to see and perceive whether those they had arrested should be classified as X or Y or Z. Those who were either would die. Those who were neither would die. For if you had either, it was treason, and if you had neither, it was murder, as you have heard and seen. But what of the war? What of it? Let me tell you of the terrible trial when the bells tolled 3. That called the interval of the era of define and provide, and the Martians imposed a scheme that was tyrannical and manifested itself in an inaugural regime that was proclaimed as the great state of Freeland. And I discovered the bottle, the wine bottle, the bottle of the sample, which was placed in a seat on a cushion on trial and tried by the rabbits and the animals in the jury. You laugh? Well, it's that bottle that held the contents of the DNA. I called the poem that I was able to detail and distill and find the tree to follow to my release. The DNA poem had been held in a demijohn, and it had floated. It had been composed in Acadia in times that were ancient, and the words had revealed an intelligence that led us to freedom through an entrance that was opened by a key being provided to me. Oh, the entrance led to the Isle of Zephyr, she that lay by the sea, S.W., the church, the mother church. DNA F, it was designated inside of me, all of us that got free at the Acadia. The glass of the bottle had melted, it being made of chemicals in the laboratory of the Acadia, out of which it had floated. Down the stream, the DNA stream, the Anastasia stream, by the sea, S.W., to save me ultimately, make a composite when I could read the machine that I have described to you, and see when I should need it after my forfeit of freedom. For I had entered the conning tower of Acadia involuntarily, after my father had been arrested to be held ransom by the Martians. Acadia was the last outpost. All else was demolished. A stream of deadly vapours of atoms and molecules of carbon and chemicals had been released by the invaders into the atmosphere and caused the deaths of all those who did not have the measurements. But let me tell you first that my father had been a soldier in the era of define and provide before the Holocaust, when I had been Prime Minister. I had been deposed, and my father made prisoner. How had this event of terror come about? I had been listening to the television in Acadia before it had been captured, and I had been living in it after discovering the poem DNA and watching its screen, when I had seen a series of images that had become blurted, voice box broken and skirted, and scaffolds shattered in a scaffold of the DNA cone form that proceeded out of my forehead. And this is what I heard. A company of soldiers has invaded the Union. They appear foreign. And then this one should complete our task, the detective said. He's got the measurements, the detective said. Lock him in. The detective placed handcuffs on the wrists. If he figures we've got power and accepts authority over him, we've got him, the chief detective said. Lift him up. Take him in. There was a coloration of the skyline. I saw the buildings, the tops of them around the park. In the distance, in the dawn, Then I heard and saw, in the Time Machine television form. They stood in front of the sergeant when the body, well, with it, looked at him. They looked at him, the body, handcuffed, it stood upright. The sergeant's face evidenced 2 crevices that were slits, eyes that looked through them. "This one's for the judge," he said. "Little respect would help," the chief detective said. "Respect is for the birds, a forgotten word." "Begging your pardon," the sergeant said. "Have you forgotten our children?" the chief detective said. "You simply mouth words," the sergeant said. "A game you have mastered. Truth is lies, define and provide. That is the way." Chief detective said, "Do you see?" He pointed to the body, the victim's mouth. "Lies are the truth. That is soon what he will sprout. The only way—" And here his voice trailed off as the sergeant said, "is to know, and we've rooted that out." "You have memory," the chief detective said, "but they are just words to you as they are to me. 1,000,000 light years away, a dialect attached." He looked at the sergeant. "Take him in," he said. "You have an ability for stating that," the detective said. "Chief," he laughed. "Trust." "Don't mention that," the chief said. His voice trailed off again. "It's all a joke. Lighten up. Be happy." "The cell's clean," he said. "It'll look like a church soon. The seats are looking like pews. There's a strange snake-like sensation. Do you see it? It's an unexpected development. Do you think anything significant is meant by it?" The sergeant looked into the middle distance. An area could be seen. "Can you hear bells?" the sergeant said. "It's a most extraordinary, strange phenomenon," the chief detective said. "Their ring is burning an unnerving white beam. Can you see it?" "You are ill, Chief," the detective laughed. "We've abolished them." "Can you be seeing the structure and dimension of the church that was once built in this place, in an hallucination that baffles time and crosses its times?" The chief detective shielded his eyes. "Can you believe," the sergeant said, regarding the chief detective, "that it is impossible to believe that one cannot finite them? Because reality has now been ushered in and defined and provided as we know it." "Shush! You'll give away where we're from," the detective said. "And we're not even supposed to give an impression to anyone, yet even amongst ourselves." "We can't make them die," the sergeant said. "That is the definition of finite. If they do not die and do not enter into our process, if they have that rare, exceptional glare of genius, they see the phenomenon that is reputed to be the sensation of light. That is our purpose on earth, to isolate." "Well, I'm not overly interested in what they do," the detective said. "So few of them have it. It is the Martians, our masters, who have transformed us, in particular from within the inner specks of our eyes' pupils that filter the light from the filament of our being, that is being located in the centre of our brains. That has been invaded." His voice trailed off again. "But what if they see the light and hear those bells now?" the sergeant said. "The very thing that we have tried to define, to ensure and guarantee we provide their identity, consequently as mirrors of the process, threatens to rear its ugly head in that event." The sergeant was silent. "The only isolated events that reveal such cases are known to issue from a source that conveys evidence that they march to a different calendar of sound from us." "That is the truth," the detective said to the chief detective who had stated these words. The sergeant thumbed through a large records book that stood on a podium that was small before him, and licked his finger as the pages stuck to it and each other as he turned them. might add in parenthesis, this is the narrator calling, that we have found this large record book, and it is exactly that from which we are reading now, that we are reading from in the old dialect terms, and that is why you hear the turning of the pages. Close parenthesis. Right, just enter him in, the detective said. Like the others, same as the others. Do as I say. The sergeant entered the details. He's prisoner number 9, he said, without capitals. We've abolished them. But I can see capitals, the chief detective said. Your hand does not know what your head is thinking. It is writing with independence. It's a force of habit, the sergeant said. Just shows you, the chief detective said. Our quest to abolish the unconscious must go on. But can we abolish love, the detective said. That's the key to it, the chief detective said. The manipulation of Earth to control its treasury of feelings of its inhabitants was the first beachhead that we instigated when we landed. So by charging the elements of the atmosphere with vapours and gases, then we introduced the measurements to rigidify and define regimentation and provide clones of ourselves. Thus, he took the strange shade of skin that surrounded his corners of his eyes in his hands, and with the fingers rolled it down. There was air, thin air, but it swirled. Dark tracks unfurled in the atmosphere and curled above the necks of the bodies to which they were attached and produced a curious gas. Uranium has been converted, the sergeant said. The chemical reaction is operating in reverse with potassium, whereas for transformation there should be an opposite reaction, which is held by these few we seek here on Earth. Quite, the chief detective said, although his voice seemed to emanate from the swirls of dark mass that were forming above the box that was held in the throat before the swirls at his neck. It's the measurements that cement the prevailing order's definition within the crevices, and forms the eyes that define the light the cortex provides. The chief detective reassembled his mask. By order, the sergeant said, and stamped the book of records. Narrator's note, from which I am reading now. The two detectives continued to stand before the sergeant. Originality is the hallmark clonism that has been introduced and designed to make divisive by the Martians. Don't you see? Pretty soon the coinage will be mimicry, universally, monosyllables. That is what they will talk in. Literary form of communication will be the simple language of the people, generally in categories. Accepted norms and principles of expression are the key to liberation and freedom, the chief detective said sarcastically. The original voice is imprisoned in the terrain of categories. The aim is to prevent them from releasing it. That way they operate like robots, I can guarantee. This device blocks out their thinking. The process operates independently. He held up a machine. It was a small box, black, with a tab-like head connected to it by a rubber hose. He went on. It is through this cylindrical hose that the gas that chemically reacts with the source of uranium that is transformed by the Patanium passes. When we measure their heads, foreheads, and treat it with magnesium, so that it bypasses the light in the soul of their brains that is contained in their skulls and prevents the cortex from reflecting through their eyes' pupils the quantum voltage that is required to keep their spirit alive. Do you see? It was developed by the Martians. They had the greatest genii for scientists. One, von Heydrich, is their leader. He was once here on Earth, and of the populace and he created a mayhem that it is impossible to describe before he was transported to the other dimension of the Martians when he died. Their queen is Jersey. She is head of their republic in a queer conjunction of a constitutional monarchy and a system of government that is such that is one in which von Heydrich is president. I see, the sergeant said. The people are kept in place by force of arms, as you have seen when we invaded, and this machine differentiates and divides the ones we have kept alive into categories, so that we can keep them in the belief that they have freedom by convincing them that they have the gift of mimicry, of the slogan of the government, by transformation of their minds into the constitutional norms of the Republic. I see, said the sergeant. The constitutional forms are reforms that are inculcated into the core of the mind by the valve's operation. In this instrument, into the cortex, the process is inserted, so that the possessor of the message that is magnetically attached to the neutrons, electrons, and protons that consist of the form of light and gases that are inserted form a quicksand of cement in the area of the forehead that foments and becomes stagnated in the recipient's minds and heads. It is von Heydrich's and Jersey's philosophy that forms the program. It designates the category, and the possessor adopts it as a behavioural pattern. The only way they can free themselves of it is to locate the spirit, and we have bypassed it, so that we have no knowledge of it. It is the inheritance of the ancients that they forget. They have no memories. The inheritance of their ancestors, who they are, their identity, their true identity, their true family. They forget them. They're divided from them. We marginalise, then dissolve and abolish them, and they have no memory of it. Therefore they have no power, because when you know who you are and know your identity, which is a product of your family tree, you have power. If it's obliterated and you're cut off from it, you are divided it. Schizophrenia firstly sets in, and then you just become purposeless. Pawn on a chessboard, one move at our direction. That is the idea of define and provide, as we have appropriated it. Marvellous, the sergeant said. The Martians, the chief declared. He was suddenly assaulted by a curious invisible phenomena that made him talk and balk. My eyes! Shield him! He called. The light! There's nothing there, Chief. The detective called. There was a loud report. Shooting! Strafing! The sergeant yelled out. They're attacking again! He raced to the window. Look out! He yelled again. A missile exploded nearby. They're lining them up, the people. They're shooting them down. Rows and rows of them. Executions! The man the detectives held between them slumped. He awoke. He looked up at the area between the sergeant and the window. There was a mirror. It stood. It had been screwed into the foundation of the floor of the reception of the cells, and was narrow and rectangular. From it emanated light, but it was surrounded by dark traces of air in the atmosphere that seemed like a projection of the facelessness of the Martians, when the detectives had removed the mask on which their shroud of horror fed. It seemed, for when the man who was a prisoner looked more sharply, he saw a link between the atmosphere's strands of darkness that bounced off the refracting mirror's surface into the area of the Martians' eyes that seemed to dilute their pupils, which absorbed them through slits. He now saw the whole reception room that had been rebuilt over the church was consisting of dark mirrors that seemed, he guessed, to be made of graphite, and as he heard the gunfire, he realized the sound was creating terror by ricocheting off these mirrors and the one in the centre, and entering the room and realm of his mind to divide his thoughts and define and provide a conflict against which he fought in a struggle to survive. He shook his head and tried to clear his mind of the impurities. But the process had taken place when he had been dealt with by the machine when arrested, stopped, thwarted. It thwarted him, and he felt that he was locked in a battle within, in which he was trying to uncork the bottled spirit in him. The DNA, this poem. But try as he might, struggle as he did, nothing could outrage, unleash the courage and powers he needed to overcome, to triumph. The scourge would win. The scourge was on his forehead. It emanated and expanded like a scarlet scar, a mark, a scar. He found himself saying, "I do not accept it. I do not accept these cries of battle, these horrors I hear, this time machined, as it were, into my brain, which is regimenting me and keying me into a tune I cannot bear, and which is alien to my mainstream." He could hear the birds in the atmosphere on the horizon. He found he could use his feeling in the gut of his being to repel the reality that had been introduced and was being defined and imposed upon him to experience. He struggled for his own reality, and when he did, he exhausted himself. But when he let go of the struggle and concentrated, he found he saw the white light that he had seen in the central mirror. It seemed to have been transported from the confines of the core of the mirror's central circle to within him, and he found that when he focused upon it and imagined strength and pure power, it descended upon him in a strange sense of healing that gave him to believe that he could cure anything. It was a majesty of power, he thought, and when he looked at the mirror he saw a strange imposing figure that twirled, literally, as if it was being transfigured from a picture of Christ on the cross to a victor, a prince of the church, healing the masses and scattering flowers around the floor of the church's vestibule that was represented. Near him stood Mary Magdalene. She wore a wedding ring. She touched his hand. She peered forward as if out of the precincts of the mirror and said, "I am watching you. I love you." The man was taken aback and thunderstruck. His soul reached out to her. "I will do your will," he said. "What does he say?" the sergeant said as he walked back from the windows. "He will do our will," the chief detective said. "He will obey. That is good. He is talking in mimicry. He will accept the service of the Republic. He is starting on the steps to the admission to his category. He will be prisoner number 9. He is a prisoner of the category. He will obtain all the benefits of his role. He will relinquish his soul to this masquerade." "But what does he see?" "He is transfixed," the sergeant said. "The mirror is reflecting the events outside the window to him. Can you see? The mayhem, it is subsiding. The shooting has stopped. The populace is tamed. Remove him! Remove him to the cells, post-haste." "You are giving the orders now," the chief detective said. "In the morning builders will come in here. They will measure the cells they're in. They will convert them. This will be one prison for all of the land." "Mayhem," the mumbling sergeant said. "That is it. Mayhem and remaindering. What will I do? What will I do for the Martians?" "You will be chief jailer after the architect has come in with the builders and they measure and construct for the great state of the Republic of Freeland, of the Martians' colonial empire under the rule of Jersey, our queen, and von Heydrich, its president. Get the picture? Do you see?" The next day the man who was a prisoner found himself in his cell. There another stood near him. She was girlish, young woman. She had a flower in her hair, the petals of which glinted in the light that came through the window, which was yellow. "I grew," she said, and smiled. "There is a lantern." She pointed to the corner of the cell. There was a garden bed of gerbils. "They grow into the lantern's light," she said, "in all the turmoil. The land has been devastated, But now I can see. When I came in here I was blind originally. The arrest demonstrated something to me, as it does for everyone who comes in here. For the child takes everyone to the church, and everyone has it. The genius that is a gift that is hidden in the fibres of their mind, are waiting for them to discover it, as it has done for you. Did you see the Christ at the Magdalene, in the vestibule, in the mirror of the church, in its foundations, in the stream of all life, the source, the womb that channels all birth? It is the union of the Christ and the Magdalene that restores you, as if it were a husband and wife having had a child. For those you see, there is a renaissance, a miracle. Rejoice, you are free. I heard the alarm go off in the cell. I guessed they were watching me, but she went on. But these precincts, they are holding me, the man said. The man was I in the mirror. I looked at him, my double, as he said. I and prisoner number 9, they told me. Do you not see, the young woman said. I am the child Magdalene. You have come to me. The man rubbed his eyes. This is a mystery, he said. The clue is time, the young woman said. You have trekked on a journey. You are in another area. You have crossed lines. You are in the 1st century. The 1st century. Sure as Christ has been resurrected with me. There it was again. The camera, the tricks, they were watching me. As sure as Christ has been resurrected, she said, with me. You have been given life. You have found family. You have found the tree. Do you not believe in the Trinity, the tree? Do you not believe in the journey that converts the 3 to a quaternity? These lines of the soul that form the walls, they are 3. They are 3. The 4th is invisible. It is open. Look! I coughed with the poison Martian gases coming in through the area that had been opened, with the ticking sound I had heard as she walked to the wall that was standing in the darkness over the gerbras, and the lantern shone, and over the garden bed there were bells. The bells rang, they sounded 12. As they clashed with the ticking, the murdering gases were coming to me. They were the bells of the church, a cathedral that stood in the 1st century. I saw. The bell's sound was contained in a light with entrancing eminence, foreclosing on the garden which opened into a stream, which contacted with a river, the water of which entered the bed of the garden to dissolve it and reveal a trapdoor that opened as the man in the original audible had opened, and I laid hands on it and raised it, released it, and went down and out. Death was near. It stood nearby, a ghost that flickered its eyes, looking mortally upon the mayhem all around. The Martians had reached an area some 60 metres from where the officer stood, and the no-man's land in between was littered with the corpses of the dead, where blood ran like a river of red. The capital lay some 20 kilometres behind the lines, and its architecture stood in a Gothic, eerie structure in which peaks and temples poked into the heavens. There was not so much as a semblance of hope to be seen, to be perceived, as invisibly strewn between the sinews of tissue of the souls of the soldiers who had come together to make a last stand under the commander. The year was the last in the turn of the century, and the month was June. Many were almost dead on their feet, tottering and sapped of strength. They clung to faith, a golden thin thread. It was all they had, but it was strong, for although a miracle was for what they longed, the soldiers belonged to a Christian nation, and although the attack upon them was 3-pronged, and despite the odds, they believed God led them on. Farther, behind the lines, but before the capital lay a centre that was headquarters of the commander-in-chief of the battle. He looked on from his tower and radioed signals to his commander in the field as he watched through his binoculars. The Martians had come, had devastated the world with vapours and guns. Some of them stood before him now, as the soldier who remembered looked on upon the scene that was returned to his memory in the cavern. Others, who had been transformed as prisoners when captured, had been placed in the front lines by the Martians to fight and conquer for them. They had been unsuspecting traitors, harnessed by the spurious gases of the Martians and turned on their fellow man when arrested or captured by instruments that were unusual and contained in black boxes that were attached to cylindrical hoses that held tab-like heads that measured them. As the world's vacant eyes had looked on from its devastation and treeless desolation, France had joined the English in the Anglo-Martian Wars region on their side of the Channel when much of France had fallen. The Germans had been dissolved, as had the Russians, the Americans and the Asians, but in France and England the Martians had changed their methods and started arresting, stopping. Some pockets of Africa held out, and isolated areas in the South Pacific where a militia of Indians was rumoured to have leapt to the breach and held a bridgehead outside Suva upon the demise of the Fijian army and governmental system. France had taken the brunt of the assault by the Martians. Most of her men were dead. The population had been evacuated from Paris, and the city stood, a hollow shell in which streets stared in silence into the air. The women and children had removed to Bordeaux and lonely outposts in Algeria and Morocco. Alone stood London. Many had transported to Scotland, but Edinburgh was cut off from communication with the south of England, and Ireland was incommunicado and blacked out. Italy was spent, her armies tired and dispatched in a joint failed effort of the alliance she had hastily made with Spain and Portugal. The whole southern part of the Mediterranean had been emptied, and when the Martians had first attacked, their rockets had knocked the entire orbit of the world out of balance on impact. And the gravitational laws had only been restored when the Mediterranean had poured water from her southern shores, and energy brought in contact with the Earth's geological and meteorological pattern to right the imbalance after the water's volume flooded North Africa, leaving just the Algerian and Moroccan pockets. Greece was saved. The home of the ancients had avoided the wrath of the invaders, as had part of Israel and the crux of Christ and Magdalene and sections of the Middle East. Rocket fire had levelled all, and missiles had recoiled the populations in the face of explosions wrought from flying saucers. The Martians had descended from these inventions when they had landed, and presented a curious presence that was represented in coils of swirls and swirls, dark masses of energy and specks and evidence vapours and gases, and eyes that looked through slits like ice that were molten hot. Everything they touched exploded into thin air, and pressure was brought to bear on the population as they ran about in the wake of the initial invasion with black boxes and instruments, measured and captured and took prisoners in France and Britain. Other areas the population had disappeared. Murdered? No one knew. Communication lines were broken. Perhaps there were a few savages starving, roaming in areas and hills, or hiding in the cities. Rome, Berlin, Bonn were believed to have been ravaged by looters and plunged into prostitution and robbery. Robbery, while women and men danced to a tune that signalled Armageddon of the earth, in which they laughed insanely as the Martians looked on, took their terrible toll that was their price in their search for worth. They executed their plan to continue their march to power and conquer Earth. The British, the line exhausted, exhausted at the line which had barely held and looked like a thread, fought a rearguard action as their statesmen looked on, apprehensive of the Martians delivering the death knell under von Heydrich, their leader, and Queen Jersey. Damned the men were. The spirit appeared to have left them and taken life with it, in a blood-curdling terror that had split the world, for in the area where the Mediterranean's water had bled, it continued to seep and hemorrhage from a source that would not heal, and continually wept, despite the gravitational pull's return to the Earth's orbit to form a fissure that looked suspiciously schizophrenic and dribbled into the jagged edges that consisted of the split surface. Chasm had moved apart, become greater as the Martians assaulted with their missile and rocket power. Gases and vapours hissing through the vacant avenue that was created between the world's two remnants. The flying saucers flew, machine gunning and forcing their crews to manoeuvre askew as the contraption's supersonic inventions targeted areas blew them apart to smithereens. Island of Britain was the only area that offered resistance. France had some remnants, but the catapultic assault cathartically ripped the Union apart, cataclysmatically. Scotland and Wales and England were divided by the rivers of poisonous volumes of gases and remnants that formed channels etched into the length and breadth of their borders. Ireland literally threatened to be dug out of her foundations and pirouetted to thin air as she lifted off the face of the Earth's map and disappeared into the veils of the universe. Houses of Parliament had fallen in the capitals as the Martians had scored direct hits, boom, 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 one after the other, after strategically marked them out and isolated them from former reconnaissance aircraft before they attacked. Few stragglers had come to the shores of Britain. They had come from Lisbon and the Moroccan regiments. All had entered and fought in the region from North Africa and Portugal. The young man who was remembering these horrors and terrors and the vapours and forces that had tormented him, tormented me as I watched and tried and describe this mayhem and terrible destiny, had begun to wonder and question whether the earth was cursed, paying for crimes and being punished in the universe for the double-crossing of God, who was seeking vengeance upon the planet by using the Martians for violent employment. Time and space seemed to have passed. They seemed to have come to an end, to arrive at a destination that was past the last railway encampment where the lines of St. Mary's train had been blown apart, simply ran on in a vacuum. Now, as he looked at the return of these awful visions, he saw the actual event in which the Martians had driven the prisoners they had captured from the trenches out of which they had arisen, and marched them, prodding them all the way with instruments that were material of the type that was like picks and maces and pikes, and made them charge their former companions as if in a replication of Karma and Ireland's inhabitants. But the British blasted and the attackers, I could just see it. The attackers died before their eyes, and it was then that it occurred to the man who remembered this action was an effective way to demoralize those who did not have the measurements the Martians sought by their instruments. But I remained stoic and static, realizing that it was in my power to be so static. At least the identities of the prisoners were not known to me. I tried to raise the shutters that had been clamped down over my eyes inside my head, my darkness inside the rock. It was as if I remained stoic, yes, realizing that the power had bled. Prisoners' identities were known to me, although I could not perceive those who were being transformed out of all connection with recognition of anything that was human. It was my voice. The circle was beginning to link up with the shutters raising up and seeing the grey light, and it was by the stream of my voice that I could express myself and see what had happened, and had a chance of healing myself. Yes, That was it. These prisoners had half slits, eyes for eyes, and their faces were made of shale and scales like fish of ancient times. It appeared like a creature of black lagoon. It appeared to my eyes, had no soul, and it occurred to me that perhaps it was me in the mirror that I could see that had suddenly slammed down outside the open window. I was looking at myself, projections projecting. It occurred to me that perhaps the little black boxes and the instruments were removing them, stealing them, vomiting them, me, the impurities, the muck embedded in the DNA in my soul, out of it, out of me, out of the triangle, the rock, which I was embedded and inserted where it had inserted the Martians' images. I was being healed this way. That way, by inserting them their own images they could control. Their behaviour became conformity with their role that was defined by the identities they believed they had become in poverty of soul. If they believed they were richer in personality, had believed they were so born and grown, perhaps they would have had the power to harness a source that would have allowed them to repel the effects of the invasion and save themselves. The Martians' invasion had snatched their bodies' souls. But this observation did not make them less of a force with which to be dealt. As he and I continued to look over the trenches and no man's land, I saw that the Martians' prisoners began to rise up again, and although I had dismissed a hurling doubt, the world seemed to topple, tottering on its very axis on which I seemed to stand when I had stood on the rectangular flat ground that was this place. They had seemed to reach the very last time of the earth. All had seemed lost. On their hands the history of the world would be written in blood, telling the story of its demise. For any survivors, his fellow officers, fathers who had all stood, my grandfathers, with him then, at the turn of the 21st century. Now I, in the ancestral line, would be desecrated in the annals of its repository as those in whom God's trust had was forsaken, as I had taken on the mission it was given to me, and Britain and the others, to complete with France and their respective countries' women for their children. The inheritance I had realized as I gazed across the lines would be lost to Europe. There seemed absolutely no way to turn the tide, but he had tried, and then his attempts to do so had died, upon which at such a point I had noticed their side's fortunes had gone forward a little. London had been protected. She had not fallen. She was ringed by weapons, yet would they be effective? I fortified by soul, could fight, but would she survive to do so? I began to will victory in my mind, in the belief that I could make it happen, if I could continue and persist resolutely, thereby avoiding defeat against the greatest periods of my life that were swirling around. But I felt I had allies, that they were invisible inventions in the form of ideas that were prompting me, in the angels, and if I could harness what they said by listening, I could do something. The spirit of my soul's connection with my movement over me had seemed in this moment to answer me, and my sorrows seemed to leave me. I coughed in the poisonous gas on the latest assault. My voice was taken from me and given up hope. I had felt that I had experienced an awakening, however, because a breaking down of our outer core, as if I was really going forward, breaking down an old barrier, the ego, and going forward to a new dawn, a new self, a wider understanding. Suddenly, for I could see, all around in the field of battle, the spirits of Jesus and Magdalene, looking on, willing us to believe, helping them, starting to resurrect me from this agony in which the countries of the world had descended into mayhem and bordered on oblivion. I looked at the vestibule and the invisible air, the ribboning molecules. Inspiration had appeared. In the eclipse there was a song in the air, as if it veered in the sound of music to the ears, for I could believe that I could perceive an ability to peer into the future and see victory and peace. The situation in which I found myself now, at this point, was that I dreamed, was a picture that was presented to myself. It presented itself in such a manner that it appeared. It had persisted for years, as if the Martians had invaded through the ages, down through the centuries of distant past, hurtling the boundaries of time that divided and banished history from their grasp as they clasped the bonds and notches that were invented and went for markings that registered our existence, our civilization's existence, in reality, in the palm of their hand structure and power of their weapon and vapours, and dissolved them with impunity, as if they fell apart like an avalanche of their genius that they employed to cast asunder and part the world genetically and generally. An open chasm stood before them. All that would be required would be a quantum leap to eternity, when the soldiers filled it with good, if they scented victory. But still the Martians' prisoners came on. Perhaps the Martians had cleansed, I then believed, for one fleeting moment, for the world could start again. It could rid the earth of its torment and bequeath a legacy that would derive from a source of God and grow properly for all to see, a planet in the galaxy that shone like a diamond for all to see. But for the moment no solution could be conjured. The thin air was grimly cut by shot to pieces from both sides of the trenches. From the initial battle had flown the series of losses, then stalemate. Collapse had killed the old order beyond retrieve. It was time to go on. There was no alternative. It was time for a new world of growth. Was the new era. That could be no going slow. A quickening of energy must be released for the British Army to have time to breathe. The Air Force could revive. It had largely been shot out of the skies, and the Navy's ships had been exploded in the Channel by the Martians' gases, direct hits that had blown up the flagship's bridge in a culmination of the assault, before flying saucers had sunk it by diving and spraying its bows with lethal gases, on which I choked on the bridge of the aircraft carrier that had been blown up at its prow, and mortally wounded rolled over in the sea and died. The other ships of the RN had plunged to the bottom, near the Isle of Wight, off the coasts of the Heads of Allen Bay, and the chalk cliffs of Dover. Leaving these incidents in their demise, the Martians had raced flying saucers and supplied up to the front that had opened up against the army. They travelled in a split-second fashion, fixing their destination on compasses that sped up their fuselage, that drove their rocket power to contract between their positions when they were not screeching and diving and attacking. Doors opened as they landed, and swarms of vacant swirling masses emptied into the continent and Britain to annihilate and pulverise the last remaining forces of France and the United Kingdom. So I watched and made these last observations on the microphone from my hidden capsule tower in this dreadful wasteland grey zone. It has been in this situation that the man who dreamt had looked at the grey skies, day after day, and blessed starry nights as a poet. The stars had given their twinkle to earth and reaffirmed belief that there was something wonderful that created earth. Mama! Mama! The simple light, years away, that travelled, made thought for a better day, and understanding of an order if things were in balance, in silence. As I dreamt, I could see the face of my youth, and it began to grow into the lined furrows of the man on the front, the man in front at the window in the mirror, and the shutters had risen in the rectangular mirror window I saw, which seemed like a mandala, a circular circles, a vision, a portal. I could see the eyes in my forehead. The portal seemed to mirror. Yes, I could use longitudinal dimensions. I could use a ruler. I could use a set square, a triangle. Quick, make the markings, the rulers, the measurements, and that way I could pinpoint, plot the portal, the centre, keep it on the map for me to use any century, any time when the Martians annihilated, attacked, and I could disappear. I threw behind the frame. I would put the picture in the front of Magdalene, and that way they would never know the visible portal. The hole was there and came through at a certain time. Like now, up the shutters would raise, and I would go through, disappear. Yes, I knew the time. All I had to do was, like Voltaire with the Lisbon earthquake, arrange for the Martians to attack me at a time when I knew the lights would cross, the picture of Magdalene would go up, and the shutters would go up, and I would go through and get out and down the tunnel, race away. Then the shutter would close, and I would never be known. I would be the escapee, the great escape, the invisible man.